We're back with more Feed the Trolls. And a couple of you, I do another podcast. And on that podcast, I've always had people in the comments being like, you got to get KingT on the show. So I listen to you sort of. And we've now got him here.
It's the one where you want like people who aren't super famous players to be like pitched to be, which is basically his whole gig. If you don't know, like his whole thing's like finding the next up and coming players. Sure, right?
Yeah, they basically a couple of people in the comments were like, you need to bring KingT on, and then he must rate the two of yours decisions and what you've said about these players.
Okay,
right. He's like, I'm down now. Okay.
Yeah,
so we might do that down the line, but now we're actually bringing him in here for Feed the Trolls for an episode where. I want to talk about, I'm going to make just a random statement here, but I want to talk about how I think Falcons really messed up a couple of the top tier Counter-Strike teams by coming in with their moves. And I'll take you down this journey and walk you through what I think they've done and where I think they've messed up. And I'm hoping the two gents with me will be able to give us a little bit of insights. But in order to do that, we got to go all the way back to when Falcons announced they were making this move into Counter-Strike, right? So they'd made a move into Dota. I think their Dota team is one of the top Dota teams in the world. They've got their face. I think he's meant to be like the CEO. Who knows? MS Tasari. He is one of the best FIFA players in the world. They've kind of purposely gone and signed the best of the best to be the biggest organization in the world. And then they made this move into Counter-Strike. And the truth is, KingT, the team we see now with Falcons is not the team they originally wanted. So let's talk about that first move when they found what they felt was the best coach and announced the super team. Who do you think was meant to be that original Falcons lineup?
Wow, well, we know the conversations that came to light clearly indicate a couple players, that being m0NESY, Nico. Now, Nico, I think, is the primary target. m0NESY is more like just a bonus that comes along with it. He's not as big a brand, not as big a name, but in terms of actual Counter-Strike on the server, obviously outstanding player and such a tight link with Nico, like almost like, big brother, little brother, brought him into tier 1, into G2, and has since, lit up the world side by side. So I think that was the idea initially. As in terms of a full 5, I'm not sure what to believe sometimes with what I'm actually being told and what's real, but I think Snappi is a likely pick to go next to him. How many of the other riflers come along? Do they end up with BOROS? Is that part of their thinking? Is another question. But I know for sure the two that I'm pretty locked in on, they definitely wanted, and we know they've now gone and taken another shot at one of them, is Nico m0NESY, because that would have been, you want the title super team, 2 of probably, at the time, top 10, at times top 5 players in the world, is a great way to start it off, no matter who you sign for the rest of the team.
Well, that was the thing, right, Thorin? Nico was meant to be the sort of talisman of this team that was going to attract all that other talent. There was all sorts of stories online that this deal was basically done. And then all of a sudden, Nico comes out and says, nah, I'm actually staying with G2. We've spoken about this. The argument would be he stayed with G2 because G2 had all the partner spots and Falcons didn't. And he wanted this last year to be able to play in all the big tournaments, right?
Which, by the way, didn't in itself age very well, because right after that, Falcons bought it wasn't a partner slot, it was like whatever that expansion slot was that they made for the league. So obviously they got into Blast anyway. It's why they're actually playing Blast as we record this right now, basically. So that angle already aged badly, which is why I'm not surprised that suddenly the same story resurrected, didn't it, this year, of like, actually Nico will go there, but this time instead of for 2024, it's for 2025. So I think the angle that people always go with on this is, if you look at the rumors, it was implied they were going for a super team. Like, it genuinely does look like, I mean, first of all, they had Zonic, so obviously we know he has an eye for talent, but it looks like for real, he didn't really pick the players he even ended up with now. He went down like a HLTV top 20 type list, and hence he was taking, like, Nico, the best rifler ever from CSGO, m0NESY, who people have to remember wasn't actually this m0NESY from CS2 yet, but like KingT says, he was a top 10 player, he was still a very good player, and he was obviously one for the future. By the way you can infer they wanted m0NESY as well as Nico isn't even just the whole angle of, like, their pals on G2. It's that right around the time the rumor was they're getting Nico, and remember, they already had Zonic and Magisk at this point. That's when G2, apropos of nothing, just made a statement like, m0NESY is not available for any amount of money. It's like, that sounds a little bit too much like people are inquiring about m0NESY and asking every day, so how much for m0NESY, how much for m0NESY, or just DMing m0NESY all the time. So I think that, in some ways, that went out of its way to tell you. They're probably trying to get m0NESY and tap him up too. And if he just played with Nico, you figure it has to be a good angle. But I think the one that people forget, because if you think of those 3 players, this would be a totally different team, Tekko. If you start the team with Zonic coach, then you bring in Magisk, who everyone just thought was a brilliant, like, fucking like Anchor, sort of like kind of like a supportive but still like skilled player. Obviously, the other angle from when they were in Astralis together was Magus briefly IGL'd when Glaive was unavailable because he had that illness time when he was out of the lineup. So people have even inferred maybe one day he will become an IGL. So people think he's going to stick with Zonic, and that's like an angle. So maybe even could have been the IGL team. Who knows? You have that. If you then add Nico, you're already cooking. If you add Monacy, bro, like, well, that's like 3 out of 5 of an amazing lineup. And then people forget who was the other name who publicly said he would not join was Twists. Twists at the time had the world as his oyster, won everything in phase, and he could choose, couldn't he? He could have gone to a Vitality, suppose he had that offer, could have gone to Falcons. He himself went out of his way publicly to make that statement, like he wouldn't be involved with that shit, implying something along the lines of the political angle, we assume. And so you look at these names, these are fucking straight fire names. You start with those names, you probably look at maybe could have still failed, but you obviously set a very different expectation. But the problem is, yes, the issue was it's actually the secret to building brand new rosters I had to learn. The reason why it's so hard to do is because no great player right now will join one because he already is in a great team. That's why he's one of the great players. And he has the option to join the other teams. Like, essentially, here's the question. If you're someone like Twists, aside from the money, or in this case, he wanted to do the TL Super Team project, even if I was going to join a team, I'd join Vitality. They're already going to win everything. And they just win everything, I wouldn't go and start a brand new project because, as you can see, if even the last name gets fucked up, you've ruined the whole thing, and that dream lineup isn't there. So, unfortunately, I do get the sense, and this is actually, if people don't know, 4 years earlier, why the Cloud9 super team of Kassad and Henry G failed. Because their problem was they tried to do the same thing. They went down the list of names and they had to go so far down till the first name, which was like Woxic, you can imagine wasn't like top 5 player, etc., that by the time they built the rest of the roster out, which they then did, the last name famously had to be Essetag for an enormous bag. And everyone's like, what? You've built a super team where Essetag completes it. And famously, that was essentially a team, reminds me of Falcons right now, where it's like, you have the pieces to be good, but you forgot to get the star players. Like, in the same way as they had Woxic and SunPayUs in this team. Where's the star rifler? Because, by the way, that team in Cloud9 was supposed to maybe have like a Nico, a JKS, at least a Jacob was the minimum. Like, these were the sorts of players they were going for at the time. They didn't do it. And I actually think if you build a super team from the floor up, you'll never get the super team. Because as you say, what brings the other players to the super team, or all the, in this and that scenario, Nico's milkshake brings all the boys to the yard or whatever. That's such an old reference now, even though it's a bag, right? Obviously, in this case, that's why you join, because you want to play with Nico and get the bag, and you think, I've got Zonic, I'm going to win everything. So the problem is, that story is completely true. Even though Richard donked on Nell because of the way he supplied, it was actually, as far as I know behind the scenes, completely accurate. All Nico basically had to do was pick up a pen, dab it in blood, and then just sign the contract, basically. And then he just, like, 1 second, like a movie for real, like right before he went to sign it, like as he's putting the pen down, the camera lens goes like grayscale, and he just sees all, there's a rainy sound in ASMR, like, and he just sees all like Monacy, and then like Nexa and Hunter and Pekka, and he's, in this might, except because he's Nico, he's actually just looking and going. He's imagining like the online qualifier to an IEM without a Louvre spot. He's imagining that blast showdown where you lose to Metasport. He's actually going, you know what? I'm Nico. I don't need this shit. So he didn't join it. At the last second, he was like, actually, I don't join. And he just did back out of it. And unfortunately, that did seemingly destroy the whole project. Because then the issue, as we're going to get to, I've no doubt, is they did get the other pieces, but they lack the piece that makes, essentially, if this is a jigsaw of like an old woman with a kitten, all we've got is like some of the kitten's legs and like the old woman's hair. We haven't got, there's no actual cat or old woman in the picture. So it's an incomplete jigsaw, isn't it? So yes, I actually do think that there's a world where if you rewind it, and the Terminator 1000 comes out and forces Nico to sign some Saudi Terminator 1000, then I think this team would be a super team already. Yeah, it would be a very different world.
Caveat though, quickly, do you think, KingT, were they going to keep BOROS as like a sort of, look, we have a Middle Eastern player in this lineup? That is always something I've been curious about. I was like, was that part of the deal when they said to Zonic, cool, you can build this team, but we want this guy to stick around because it kind of represents the region and we think that he's good enough?
I think that's, to a certain like marketing extent, that might have made sense. But realistically, if you're trying to essentially dominate the Counter-Strike world, you don't need to tie yourself back to the Middle East in particular. It just needs to be the best team that's going to win a bunch of events. I think people still to this day will remember the teams that won back-to-back majors. You don't even have to be that great, but people remember those moments, like those glories. Even a Grand Slam for Liquid still carries half their fan base, through the hard times. So I think they just needed the best team possible. And BOROS, I think, they arrived at a point where they had built the other pieces up. They had support They had an AWP, they had a caller, they had a soldier for their caller as well in Marden, and they're like, I guess seeing as we can't get anyone who's a proven sure thing going to deliver the frags, we're going to keep the next best thing, which is a young player who, at like a major, showed us that he could bang with the best. He could frag like a true star rifler. It's just he's had such a minimal amount of time in the spotlight. We don't really know how real it is. That's a risk we're willing to take. Now, clearly, that fell apart, not really because of the Counter-Strike. Even if you look at their like final big, like successful event at Katowice, they make a semi-final. In the quarterfinal, he absolutely obliterates someone on Mirage. It was ENCE, right? The Polish ENCE who'd upset a bunch of people. He single-handedly won that second map. Like, he was clearly mechanically gifted enough. He could play that role. It's just he wasn't a first choice. Let's be very clear about that. He was a risk. They knew he was a risk. I'd be genuinely shocked if they actually thought that keeping him would somehow help them with the marketing. I think it was genuinely a Counter-Strike decision in the end, and it didn't really pay out, but at least they tried something. I preferred that to signing, well, at that time, if you'd taken Dupree in, I would have just given up immediately. At least BOROS gave me something to cling up.
Sure.
I was like, maybe he can be as great as I think he is.
So I don't think it's an implausible angle, Sam, because I will say right now in their Falcons team in Dota, which is really successful, they do have a player from Jordan there, which I assume they're just considering the whole region, or maybe, I don't know, maybe they even want a Muslim background. I don't know particularly, but I don't think that's a coincidence, even though I will say in this particular case, that guy is a much better Dota player and more successful than BOROS was in CS. I would say it's like probably a bit of both. Like, if I had to guess, I think it's more like you had BOROS as what you call it, the placeholder in the lineup. And if you really could have had Nico or another, you just slot them in that spot, or Twists instead. You put them in that spot. But if you can, as a fallback, I think he has the double whammy, doesn't he? He's young, so you think to yourself, hey, he might be a top player. By the way, that year, remember, everyone saw he was fucking really skilled. Like, actually, we all thought if someone, maybe it's Zonic, can pilot his brain, maybe he can become one of the best players. And then simultaneously, he does obviously have that background too. So I think that helps. It certainly helps to sell to the crowd. I mean, I will say, without making this political, there is a reason why there is one player in ENCE they didn't sign. And if you look what country he is from and how, let's say, he is received if he goes to an event there by the crowd, you could also infer there is certainly some sort of geopolitical sort of underpinnings to some of these moves. Yeah.
We're going to get into that in a little bit.
Oh,
I mean,
my
do
Lord,
you think
okay.
Snappi? Do you think
right.
Snappi was? Do you think Snappi was the first choice for IGL? Because my understanding was he was picked up pretty early on. There was a conversation that he was going that way. So he was Zonic sort of said, "This is my guy. This is who I'm going to bring in here."
I actually do think for real that he might have been the first option. Because when I try to think what other in-game leaders could you get, but crucially, would Zonic want? Because remember, at the time Zonic makes this project, he has the best stock you can imagine. Even though it turns out, as he revealed in my interview with him, part of why he left Vitality was also that they were like downsizing salaries, and he was literally asked to take like an enormous pay cut after he just won the major for them within a national team. So look, that part might piss you off, but I also got the vibe that it wasn't just like he was getting less. It was also like because he felt disrespected, and he's just won everything, by the way, with an international roster, remember, including people like Dupree, who everyone thought were washed. By the way, you don't win majors with like the same players years later. That's not even a thing. People barely ever win multiple majors. So I think at the time he had the ultimate stock. So I think he had his pick of the world. But Zonic also, I think, is actually a very discriminating individual. He isn't the guy, as I think you get the vibe from the famous BOROS video. He's not the guy who'll just play with anyone who goes, oh, just put anyone in the lineup. Good job, guys. Get him next time. He's actually a guy I think is very demanding, and he has ideas of excellence. But I think he doesn't play just for the bag, as people say. I think he wants to be the best, and then he wants the bag as well. Because look, a lot of people, when you get to the top of the world, you think you're obliged to get the bag. Like, you're owed it. You did all those years where maybe you didn't get the most salary in the world. So I think he might have been the first choice. And the reason I say that is, as you say, way before Snappi actually made the official move, and it was even rumored in news posts. I know Snappi, so I can actually tell you behind the scenes he already had told me, like, basically, I've got this move. It's basically up to me. I can decide whether it happens. At the moment, I am deciding between this and ENCE. I believe there was like another offer, but he didn't want that. He was either going to stay in ENCE and stick with his boys and do that thing, or he was going to move. And if he's going to move, it wasn't even just like this lineup's the shit. It was sort of like, I'm going to move because I have spent my whole career as a journeyman. I've never had the top salaries. I've only got the success at the end of my career. If I'm going to do one last run, I also may as well get the bag and have the super team and have my chance to have an equal of Odyssey and loads of money. And then I'll sort of like me and Zonic will do our last blaze of glory, as it were. So the reason why I would speculate it actually might be the case that he would want Snappi is I actually think he would think of Snappi and know that. Whereas I've heard between people like Megisk and Glaive, I've heard there was sometimes friction was on it, and sometimes they did disagree about how it should play or what the call should be. I get the sense with Snappi, he's a level above Snappi in terms of status, and he knew that he would have like the coach control. And I also think he thought he was to some degree malleable and listen to him, because actually someone like Snappi is at that position, like Cadian, where they've done everything except win all the majors and the biggest tours. All they need is that last step. So if the guy comes along and sort of like, hey, look, I not only just did it, but I am the guy who wins the majors, they are going to be receptive to that guy, because it sounds like he can take you to the promised land. So I actually suspect it is possible that he was the first choice. It's just that obviously now people are going to think that's impossible because it's gone so badly in CS2. But I think at the time, Snappy's stock was also very high. A lot of us who looked at this ENCE lineup back that year were like, bro, isn't this like a lineup that should be sort of like an OG lineup? And somehow they're like in the finals of tournaments and like going deep. So I think a lot of people were very impressed with Snappy back then.
Yeah, I mean, he's done... Sorry.
No, you can jump right in. We can chat about Snappi.
Because that's what I was about to mention, is he is a bit of a weird choice in that sense for a super team, because so much of his career has been about taking pieces and maximizing them. And then to see him then technically be the lead for a team that was meant to have Nico, m0NESY, did feel a bit odd, but I think it ended up being better just because they missed a bunch of stuff.
Right.
And you saw that with the initial success. Because, BOROS isn't playing the same sort of style that he was in Monty. Because Monty, it was, well, let's be real, there's not a great depth of IGL proficiency. It's more like, hey, we are going to have fights we like taking and we're going to go take them. That's why you saw him swinging mid, sometimes bone dry, sometimes with one flash on Mirage, over and over and over again in that side. And he had 27% opening attempts just because he had raw aim and they trusted him. He clearly had to be forced into more, I think, proper roles in this Falcons roster, but Snappi still managed to make it work. He made it work with him. He managed to make it work with a slightly off SunPayUs and with some role players who just aren't that sharp. So that kind of worked out for them, but I do think it has to be said, it's a weird choice to bring in the min-maxer of the gods into the team that's supposed to be just pure firepower and great players. That was a bit of an
I will say that is a very fair point, because it's also why, even though you never got the call up, even when I used to say MSL should be in all these teams, I also was worried what happens when he gets the big superstars, because like you say, these are the players who take the younger players themselves and then develop them into the guy who's going to do that role. I'd actually give the obvious analogies. LXEB, when LXEB got his shot with m0NESY and Nico, it was just kind of a bit all right. It wasn't bad. It wasn't insane though. Whereas actually he has, in theory, worse players on paper in this Na'Vi team. But it's like you're saying, they're open to the system. They're open to being developed. So it kind of works. I know what you mean. It's the joke is this actually would have been the best fallback one if you knew you weren't getting Nico. As far as I know, that's not actually how they did it. But true.
So now we're going to hold off on the Falcons there, because they're there. They're trying to sort out their super team. On the other side, everyone's talking about it again. So Heroic is falling apart. This was a team that was up there, one of the top teams in the world. There's all this teenage girl drama happening. Cadian's out. The other two are going to Astralis. Heroic now is in a position where they're looking for players. And then there's this team, ENCE, who I thought was doing such an incredible run. People were getting really excited about them. I was one of those people. I loved watching them. Snappi had this team that was just working so well. They seemed to gel so well. But there are obviously now these little rumors going that he's heading to Falcons. What was it about that ENCE lineup towards the end of CSGO KingT that worked, as it was when Snappi and Madden and all of them were getting into those finals and playing so well?
Well, a lot of it is sort of the IGL AWP. Snappi, firstly as a leader, has always been really good at optimizing two positions, his AWPer and his Star Rifler. When Spinks came into ENCE, he came from nothing, got loads of setup. He basically has three people creating space, advantages, little things for him to go and frag. And he did that again in ENCE when he lost Spinks. He brought in Nertz. He had SunPayUs on the AWP who, sure, had shown us something on that Movistar Linus write-up, but he hadn't really developed fully. His T-side game was limited. He never went for a lot of opening picks. He didn't provide much beyond a flashbang. And then on CT side, sure, he got into the groove, multi-kills, openings, all that stuff was great, but it was a very held-back version of what SunPayUs could be. And in ENCE, under Snappi, he became not even a star, borderline superstar. He was amazing. If you look at their run to the final of Katowice, if you ignore that grand final where they just weren't up for that task, it was a step too far. SunPayUs is on something like a 1.27 rating. He leads them in opening attempts, opening kills.
Pro League, you mean Pro League, yeah.
I'm talking about Katowice.
No, Katowice was phase G2. You mean Surely you mean ES Pro League? That was the one where they played face.
Yeah.
It's all good.
Just
my
Snappi,
the guy in the comments says KingT didn't watch the games. He did. It was 2 years ago.
Getting my Snappi SunPayUs combo wrong.
It's all good.
I know what you mean.
2 years
Pro
ago.
League. Yeah. The memory, it's fading already. I'm washed.
It was a long time ago in Counter-Strike years, so we get it.
Like 2 years in Counter-Strike is like 20 years in real life. It's like that planet on Interstellar, isn't it?
Yeah, it's madness. But no, he really was the be-all and end-all, and it just happened to help. Somehow it feels weird saying this, considering how much we all like Nertz. Nertz was an added bonus almost in that team. But truly, he was optimized. He got to take his fights. He got to really thrive under Snappi, and that was really what made them work. Snappi had Dihar and Madden who were just willing to die for no matter what his idea was. Even if, as they say, a bad idea executed with like full commitment is better than the good idea at half commitment. They had full commitment from 3 guys, and that allowed the Stars to just sit back, hit the shots, and win the round. So yeah, close games, always grinding it out, never dominating opponents. But because they believed in him, they believed in the system, they were able to get over the line time and time again. And yeah,
it was
really
Cologne.
It
was Cologne, not Academy. So there you go. It was Cologne you were talking about. There you go.
I knew it was one of those big ones. Good. It was a really big one, yeah. So yeah, Pro League, not that kind of event anymore, unfortunately. But yeah, the Snappi connection to his Stars was always a big part of it.
Oh, it was mega.
Yeah.
So now my understanding, because I don't have insight into this, obviously, and I'm speculating here, but my understanding is there's obviously now Snappy's going to leave. That's been discussed. There's conversations with Glaive happening to come into ENCE. Glaive thinks he's coming for these players, but these players are actually all now planning to leave. And my understanding is, and I have absolutely no way to corroborate this other than
I can tell you in a
gossip and
second.
rumors.
Keep going.
Yeah, so I'm going to see if I was right. My understanding was 3 of those ENCE players were moving to Heroic. That was the plan. It was going to be Nertz, SunPayUs, and Madden to Heroic. But then Falcons is falling apart. And they are now desperate. Their super team, the moment Nico publicly announces he's out, suddenly they're not as a sexy an option for other players. And there's no more big names that are interested in jumping over there because everyone wants to keep playing in the big teams. And they are now desperate and they've got to make a grab. And they obviously make a land grab for these 2 ENCE players. I am presuming, and maybe I'm wrong here, Thorin, but I'm presuming the grab was so that they knew that Snappi could play with them. They knew that it would give them access to certain tournaments. I mean, what was the decision to go for SunPayUs and Madden? I mean, do you have insight? I can give you the whole
background info on all this. So basically, as far as I know, when they gave Snappi his offer initially was like just for him. It was like, you're going to be the IGL of this project and work with Zonic and Magisk, and that's like the initial people we have. And this is a key point to make because I actually think a lot of people, when they think of Nico and maybe Monty now joining again, they think to themselves, well, the first thing I'd do is kick that Snappi guy. He's crap, isn't he? Look at him. And they don't realize, as far as I know, Zonic as a coach, it's his project, but in the team, it's Snappi's project. Like, this is literally, they didn't just say, come and play for us for this contract, for this money. They basically implied to him, like, this is going to be like a long-term commitment to you. You're here, essentially, like, you're not just gambling by joining our team that you have to be good next year. Like, this can be the end of your career if you want. By the way, maybe we'll even do crazy shit like in the future. Maybe we'll build like facilities for you in Denmark where people can practice since you have a family life. And so, you know, this wasn't just like I said, just a pitch. This was like a really big pitch as though he was like the central piece because since they'd lost Nico, as you say, they went the other way. They were like, right, let's build out the team. They get the IGL, then we'll build out the pieces. So when it came to who was going to come with you, though, who's going to play, that's where it gets interesting between the Heroic and the Falcons part. First of all, I'll do the Falcons part. You are right. If you go and look at the timing, famously, the crazy thing about Falcons as well was they basically had to put a roster on paper because they also had left it so long into the beginning of CS2. That was right when the RMR was coming up, like the online qualifiers to get into that, which would get you to the majors. So essentially, it's just like ENCE. When ENCE lost the players, they had to like overnight, within 12 hours or something, get the Polish players and then get through that qualifier. They had like a pressing factor. There was probably also, if I had to guess, things like glass roster, registration, and all these things you need to do, you know, sometimes a month out, 2 months out. So when they were doing that, they did panic last second, as far as I know, and just say like sort of like you can have your guys, because he wanted those guys all along. When he was going to do his moves, he could have stayed in ENCE, and if he had, by the way, I've heard ENCE could basically have done a business move. Well, we don't think of them as a team that could afford players like that on the Falcons money, but all orgs can do this. If you can go to an investor, though, and show him like essentially a presentation and go, look, I need this money, but it's going to be for this. See the team we had now, they're actually so good. This massive Saudi like super org's going to buy them. But if we can match this number, they say they'll stay, and they'll stay as a package. And then you do it like like that way. And then essentially you're gambling the future of the org, but you're doing it because you think it's worth it. It's going to be, you're going to get into the major, you're going to make the millions from the stickers. It'll all work out at the end of the equation, right? So there was an option like that to stay in ENCE. Now that's where the heroic part comes in and gets quite interesting, because the actual drama people don't know is it isn't like ENCE versus Snappi or Falcons versus, it's actually Saw and Snappi. Remember, everyone forgets that one. Saw was the coach of ENCE, and he actually, I heard, this is fire, I heard when all this rumor was going on, like Snappy's probably going to leave, but he hasn't given like final notice yet. No one knew yet. Will the players still, will they go elsewhere? By the way, I've heard even individually other teams wanted some of their players too. But when Saw, I heard when it came to Saw, his whole thing wasn't like the Snappi one of like, look, I'm in talks with them. I'm probably going to pick them, but I'll still think about you guys. You can make it up. I heard Saw's was almost like he didn't even give ENCE a chance to do that, sort of like we can match. He just figured, oh, it's ENCE. They don't have money compared to Heroic. Heroic just got millions from those VC. So I heard he was just sort of like, yeah, by the way, I actually am going to Heroic. Like, what? And so he was always going. And so then you end up with this mad scenario where, first of all, this is how much of a gangster Snappi is. I've heard when Snappi left, he was the one who recommended to ENCE, you should probably get Glaive. He'd probably play for you. He's available. And I've heard he's so legit. He even told them going in. So Glaive, I've heard, actually knew when he joined, like, look, I'll initially have these players, Snappy's team basically, but I might not in the future. And no one knows, will it be all of them? Will it be some of them? Will be one stay? Will none stay? And then when it came to the Falcons side, I alluded to it before. In a sane world, you just sign the whole roster except someone that you kick out for Magus, don't you? Obviously, you want Nertz. He's straight fire, like he's quite important. But I would suspect because of the Israeli angle, they magically didn't want Nertz. They wanted everyone else except that. Now, at the time, you probably also just mindfuck yourself like, BOROS is pretty skilled. You just do that and believe it'll work because, again, you're all going to get the bag. But then I've heard, this is why famously I've always made fun of this. If you ever watch the blast World Finals, I think it was, for that year where they played, or it might be the Fall Finals. I think it was the World Finals. I'm not sure. It was the one where they played with Glaive and this lineup of players. And famously, or maybe it was even the one where Cadian came back and played with some of them. But anyway, they kept saying at this tournament, the casters, because they'd heard this rumor that actually this core of what is now Falcons was going to be in Heroic, if you remember. And they kept saying on broadcast, sort of like, oh, they're future Heroic players or something mad like that. So at the time, people also thought, which side are they going to? Are they going to Saw, their former coach, who obviously had a lot to do with them, or are they going with their former IGL Snappi over to Falcons? And at the time, it was kind of a toss-up. That's actually also why I heard, if you think about it, they only got Nertz because he's the only one Falcons didn't want. And I've heard they were still trying to sign like SunPayUs, for example. But let's just say I've heard that like ENCE was sort of like, since you took our coach Saw though, and you just kind of took him without even getting a chance to do whatever. We'll sell you SunPayUs too, but it just costs you more than it costs Falcons if you get him. That's called dickhead tax. Like you fucked with us, so we're putting a little dickhead annuity on there. That costs extra if you want him. So they didn't end up getting him. He went with the rest of the team to ENCE. So as far as I know, I think what happened was at the end, yes, when they were Snappi had committed, but Nico said no. There's only at this point Snappi, Magus, BOROS, and then if you're pretending the French players get to stay, rounding out a lineup on paper that you have to have 5 bodies in 6 at the end of the day to have a lineup. I've heard when they had to rush at the last second, look, Snappi did want his guys. He did believe that it could work. And so they just said, right, let's do that and we'll get them. And then they probably, if I had to imagine, they probably paid over the odds. There was maybe a bidding war with Heroic and then it ended up like this. And then the weirdest part is that part I say about Heroic though, because there was still potentially a world where if the others had believed in the Heroic offer, they could have, ENCE, they could have stayed in ENCE with Glaive, right? Maybe they could have rebooted that way and thought, hey, Glaive's a legendary leader. But instead they chose to go, in the case of Nertz, with Saw. They chose to leave there anyway. So he ended up with nothing. But as far as I know, he did actually have some sort of foreknowledge going into the team. He wasn't sort of tricked and sort of baited and switched like, hey, look at this team Snappi just had. You're Glaive, surely you'd win everything. And then he joined like, right, Kyler, Goofy, that wasn't really what happened as far as I know. But as you can see, it's super complicated. It was a massive, like, behind the scenes, crazy onion with a million layers, unfortunately.
KingT, I mean, obviously we're not going to go into the Middle Eastern conflict. If you want to learn about that, you can go and Google. Okay. I don't think this is the place, but there is a Saudi Arabian organization. A Saudi Arabian organization is not signing an Israeli player. It's as simple as that. It's not going to happen for various reasons. Even if the offer was there, I'm sure there's other reasons why the Israeli player can't accept.
He might not accept it anyway, so who knows? We
don't know about that, but that is where it is. But if you took that original ENCE lineup and you put it in front of you at that point in time, I don't know about you. So for me, KingT, I said you can only have one player. I would take Nertz. That would be the player that I would want. Would it be the same for you? Would you have taken someone else?
It depends entirely what I'm doing here. Because if if I'm going team by team picking one player, I might straight up just pick Snappi because I've been basically the biggest Snappi fan I can be since we're going far back at this point. Probably the moment he starts being in international rosters, is the time I start really buying into what Snappy's doing. The way he's running teams, pace changes, his XX, the way he's using players. I thought, yeah, this is everything I really want an IGL to be doing, especially in the lower levels, trying to punch up. So no, he might be the one. But if I'm actually thinking about this as like an org trying to build the super team, I think one of the hardest things to get right is an AWPer sometimes, like especially if you can't get one of the 2 or 3 biggest ones. Like there's always, the ZywOos, s1mples when he's around, m0NESY what he's become now. If you're not getting one of those guys, it can be a bit hit and miss. And so I probably would also make the case for SunPayUs at that point. But you're right in terms of Nertz being on paper an outstanding rifler who could be a massive contributor to your team. But I think he's not at that point really game breaking. I don't think I need to have Nertz in order to be a competitive top tier team. He's a solid start. He was very well set up in a team that makes a lot of sense. He doesn't have to speak too much. He made that clear himself that on Heroic, since having Kickson come in, he's had to all of a sudden start calling his shots and have all this input in terms of how he wants to play the round. He's not a game breaker in that sense. Like NiKo can build an entire round from like 1 minute 30 on the clock to the end of it after the IGL dies, and he's seen one thing at Banana. That's not nuts, unfortunately. But maybe it will be one day, but currently it isn't. So
I think that plays to what you were saying. Yeah. It was even implied at the time. This is why some people thought it might work with the super team. It was implied people thought Snappi made Spinks and Nertz. Because remember, Spinks, like you say, looked dynamite in ENCE. And then the second he went to Vitality, he was like 80% as good for like 6 months or something, wasn't he? It took a while. And then people actually give that credit to Zonic, obviously, for leveling him up, getting him into like the style of play. And maybe Apex had some influence. So I think a lot of people, since Nertz was seen as like the remix of Spinks, like they're different players, but they're just star riflers that came from nothing at Endpoint, and suddenly they're doing awesome. A lot of people thought maybe Snappi was the reason this guy was good, which I don't think it's quite as... For neither of them is it the case. They clearly have talent, but I do think maybe he shaped their role, as you're saying, because I also agree. I think in Heroic, you've seen a lot more up and down from Nertz.
Oh, you've seen entire events where he's just been okay, like an okay rifler, an average rifler, like not a true star rifler. So I think, even at that point, I had that kind of thought in my head of like, if I have to pick a player, I'm certainly not picking Dihel Madden. At this point, I think they are tools for Snappi to wield. But I think the IGL AWP, one of those two, is probably the one I want to get right. And those two looked really damn good at that point.
By the way, you see there, Tekko, I could actually just give up this whole historian / trying to be classy, preserve history, doing all. I should just be doing like the equivalent of Us Weekly for Counter-Strike. See all that tea I was just spilling there. And then I've heard sources close to this person said he didn't want to join though. And then there was a battle between the two dads of who are you joining? Are you coming with me or your real dad? Like, that was fire, that wasn't it? No one knew about it.
It does feel a little bit like I saw Richard Lewis wrote an article where he said some people just love Counter-Strike for the drama, and it feels like that's what we're doing here. But I actually had like a very specific reason, and it was complicated, but I wanted to get to this point because I wanted to show people the pieces that were moving around here and all the chaos. But the thing that we haven't spoken about though is in all of this is the money that started getting thrown around, right? Which was a big talking point at the time of there were these massive amounts of money being offered to players who on paper shouldn't be getting, some would argue, shouldn't be getting that sort of salary. They're getting bigger salary, like a Madden is now on a bigger salary than some of the best players in the world.
The joke is he probably makes better than most players in G2 and Vitality, by the way, except like Zebu or someone like that. I'd imagine he makes a lot of money, Because all those deals were made years ago in smaller economy, and they'd sign up for the top dollar because, as you say, it was a bidding war. As far as I know.
Kassad did drop some figures, whether or not they're true, I don't know. But he did on the show actually drop some figures. But this was where the issue now came in, is now you had a situation where between these three teams, all of this money got thrown around. And the point that I kind of wanted to talk about is if we fast forward to today, where we are. So ENCE is no longer in a team that we talk about. They're no longer in contention. Heroic is no longer a team. Heroic is no longer a team in contention. And Falcons is, I would say, 5 dead men walking, because the truth of the matter is they're probably all going to get ripped apart after the major and sent away, and a whole new team's going to be built. So this entire kerfuffle that happened, KingT, with all this money has led to, I mean, do you want to say the destruction of 3 potential teams, or ultimately the breakdown of all of these teams? Would you say that's the case?
it has essentially left us with a lot of ruins to rebuild. That's where we're at. And I think if I have to give credit to any org right now, I kind of have to give it to Heroic for the fact that they have built, sure, it's not quite looking like a finished house right now, but considering where they were, the pieces they've acquired and started reassembling, they're starting to look like a real team. But realistically, you think about where these teams were after all the transfers happened and they start playing Counter-Strike, you're like, this is genuinely, 3 teams who are, historically, you think, should be from like 3rd to 7th in the world. That's where we want these teams, these players, these orgs. Not a single one has really touched that since the old cores lost their sort of points that they are holding over, all that credit we built up in our minds, they just haven't touched it. And Falcons especially, I think at this point, it's no longer even a coin flip matchup with complexity. You know what I mean? Like,
sure,
they're starting to get pretty dire. And you're right. The money presented feels kind of ridiculous when you look at the results it's left us with. They're just not up there. They needed to be. And I think it has genuinely killed a small group of teams that were just making the scene competitive. It's not about always challenging for titles. It's about, is that 7th to 8th game fun? Is the decider match to be the 4th team out of the group in Pro League actually entertaining? These teams could add a certain level of Counter-Strike to those lower games. And instead, it just feels like, them. And you have other teams who won't relate to this, who've kind of done the same thing in like VP, where you're like, we used to have such good times, and now we're just watching you just crawl around a shell of your former selves.
So now my next question is the rumble that happens after that, because this show is meant to be Feed the Trolls. We talk about things that everyone else is talking about online, but I feel like this is a conversation that doesn't happen online with the fans. I don't think they even realize it's happened, but it's a conversation that I keep hearing from coaches, from players, and it is about the fact that the Counter-Strike market at the moment for players is, and I'm going to just say it the way it's been said, is fucked because of the Falcons money that came into play, because we now have a situation where teams can no longer afford players. Everyone is suddenly wanting this massive amount of money. These huge figures have come in, and ultimately by Falcons throwing around the bag, for want of a better term, for Falcons, and I feel it's bad to probably blame them because it looks like there's more to do, but breaking down ENCE and Heroic, we're now in a situation where agents are pricing their players out of the market. Do you think that's the case, Thorin?
I do think that the buyouts and the salary demands are utterly insane. And part of the problem is, as you alluded to, it's not that they exist in isolation and someone sat down and it was like a movie, like, what number do you want? Write it down on this pad of paper and pass it back to me. It wasn't like that. Like, actually, it's inferred by the problem is players, forget even the public figures, players always talk, and it's like campfire stories. Oh, I've heard he's on 70K. No, he's on 80K. Like, I heard one last year. Here's one for you. It's a fun one. A small journalist who you won't know came to me and he was like, I've heard Device is making $70,000 a month. And I was like, that's not even true, bro. Like, I don't know who told you that, but that's like, look, he makes a good salary, but it's not, first of all, it's not the biggest, and it's nowhere near 70K. That's a story you can see via the game of telephone is compounded with each person it went through. So it probably started as like, he's on a really good salary. He's on 50K, maybe it's 60K. I've heard it's 65. And then it's eventually, by the time it got to me, it was 70 basically. So I do think that is a problem, because unfortunately players do this really naive thing where they don't look and say, oh, I've heard Magus gets the bag. But then again, he hasn't won all those majors and was a major MVP. They go, wait a minute, I'm better than Magus right now. Where's my bag? And it's like, that's not what you get signed for. You get signed off like rep, what you can do for the org, what the perception of what you will play like, etc. So first of all, even bad players you've never heard of, like, this is not a joke. There are like tier 2 and tier 3 players I've heard of, especially notoriously in the Russian and the Brazilian scene, where the buyout is like 200 or 300K. And some of these names, KingT will have heard of him, he's a specialist of that. But like no joke, I hadn't heard of some of these players, or I'd only seen the name, or I saw them in an online game once. And they want like half of a Monacy buyout. So yeah, it got really crazy. And especially the salary part, because unfortunately, players are notorious for just wanting the raw dollar amount per month baseline to be as high as possible. Even though in the modern day, you try to offset them by telling them stuff like, look, I can give you like a massive salary, but you get some of it for making the playoffs a kind of ENCE, you get some for winning a LAN, you get some for qualifying for the... A lot of people want to make it like sports and structure and bonuses, but the problem is, this is where the issue of it being a market with bidders comes in. When you have someone, on, so certainly you can blame Falcons for this. If they rock up and go, hey, everyone, anyone want 50K a month? Well, then all of a sudden, all these teams that are better than Falcons are going to go, wait a minute, why are we only getting 25K? What's that all about? So that already that's going to warp people's perception. And then also you're going to end up in a scenario where I actually do think people have really weird ideas about like what they're entitled to. So whereas like two people could make the same deal, like I just said there, one person could say, well, I'll give you 50K, but part of it's based on like, you got to have good stats. Maybe you have to make HLTV top X at the end of the year. You have to qualify to a major, things that help my org, like it makes the deal fair. Instead, the problem is if the other bidder in that same bidding war goes, oh, you just want that base salary and they're already offering it in bonuses, I'll just give you it as the base then. Well, unfortunately, even though that guy's actually doing quite bad business probably, he's going to in the short term win. And as long as everyone keeps making the short term decision, which unfortunately for players, we can't blame them for that. A lot of them are literally teenagers who are just good at wiggling their wrist in a child's video game, not Valorant. So basically, I don't blame them for not being the Donald Trump, the art of the deal or something. They're not going to know like the nuances of business. But unfortunately, a little bit of selfishness on their part has made the market insane, because if people don't know, the Counter-Strike doesn't bring anywhere close to that kind of revenue. Forget, by the way, profit. There's no profit. You don't even get the money back into the org that it costs for these enormous, like 30, 40, 50K salaries. And at the moment, this is why I used to say so many times online, people probably wondered why I would take this position. I was one of the people against getting rid of the partner system, because I knew from people like Lurpus who understand finance, getting into Blast and Louvre agreement, and especially qualifying to majors, that was one of the only ways as a gamble you could offset all those costs. If you got lucky and you had like good placings, because some of those partnership agreements were based on performance too, if you made a bunch of playoffs and let's say you made both of the majors and one of them was like a Blast Paris where it was a crazy massive major, it was the last one, you could actually potentially, if you ENCE, you could make money because they were spending very little. And if you were a big org and Navi or something, it was essentially a game of chicken where you're gambling that you're going to make that major and you're going to make all those performances. But if you do, it will somewhat offset all the millions you spent on the simple salary and signing this player. So essentially every org, and this is what our business is sadly at the moment, everyone just agreed to gamble and people just did these crazy games of chicken, which by the way, even the teams we're talking about here not only lost, but worse than that, think of Astralis. They spent like $2 million or $1.5 million to make a super team. Didn't even make the major. So that means what they thought was immediately going to pay them back that money never happened. And they were just sat there holding, well, not holding the bag in this particular analogy, having no bag would be the analogy, right? So yeah, I think it's actually, people don't even appreciate. You hear the odd story leak out, but I've heard behind the scenes, it's the deals that don't get done that show you how crazy the ideas are. That's why Cassad has been so, I would say, explicit in literally some of the deals. I've also heard when he was talking to people that you'd get a guy where he'd be like the 23rd best AWPer in the world. And yeah, they wanted a 500K buyout and he wanted 20K a month salary. And you're like, the weirdest thing about this is also where being young and delusional makes the deals weird. You'd think that can only work if there are other people bidding and you're saying, look, if you pay 30, I'll take your deal, but my other guy will say he'll pay 20. No, it's even madder. Because the buyouts, the salary demands come from the players, but because the buyout is set by the orgs do this crazy thing where small orgs who don't pay their player anywhere close to that will never even be in a major, they might win a tournament. They will just sort of play a really insane game of like, who breaks first, who blinks. And what they'll do is they'll go, I want 200K. And if you go, no, then that's it. They just don't get 200K. They keep that player and don't do anything with him. And that's just the end of the deal. What they're hoping for is that you just randomly go, shit, I guess. And then you just pay them. And so, by the way, first of all, this is the sad thing. It's worked sometimes. Some of them have got these Skulls-esque buyouts where we hear it's like 400, 600K or whatever. And you're like, what? But it's the amount of times I've heard that deal proposed. It didn't happen. And then sometimes, by the way, that player and team remained in obscurity. And so I don't even really understand what the team org, as far as I can tell, their logic's like, look, I don't really want to get rid of him. So if you just make it stupid money, I'll sell him. But otherwise, I won't do good business. Because what's weird is people don't know very quickly. The reason why that deal doesn't make sense is if you have an offer of nothing or 400K, then if you're a small org, dude, even if 150K might be good for you because you're not doing much with that player anyway. But because you're so cheap, 150K might be your entire team's like salaries paid for the year. You might have like offset the orgs. It's even bad business, by the way, by some of the orgs. So unfortunately, between agents, which want extra money, because by the way, they get an agent's fee. So they're always stimulating. I know, by the way, the other thing about agents is there's the agent that just makes the percentage of the salary. He's aligned with the player. Let's just get the most salary. There's some agents get a percentage of the deal, and that one's really sinister because some of those agents, I can tell you, will sort of tell the player, you should go to this other team because they just want a new cut of a big deal. They don't want him to stay in this current deal. So it's actually a nightmare behind the scenes, the transfer market. It's actually it's like football, but even stupider, as insane a statement as that is if you know British football.
Yeah.
KingT, you don't want to add to that? You feel like Thorin has said enough there?
I mean, yeah, I don't have that much insight because no one comes to me, obviously, with leaks.
Okay.
Like, I'm no
yeah,
reporter.
me neither. Don't worry.
But I do hear about the Brazilian ones especially, and I just shake my head. It's like maybe the Russians, I think, are better at keeping their lips sealed, or they write it all in Telegram channels. So what am I supposed to do?
Back then, we didn't used to get the info.
Exactly,
now there wasn't this bizarre media pipeline where someone takes a screenshot, translates it, and puts it on their website, whatever that is,
Yeah, so I do find some of the Brazilian stories I hear absurd. Because I'm like, yeah, sure, he's young, but come on.
Oh, it's mad.
Paying 6 figures for a player who's never played a LAN outside of their little town in Brazil is absurd. But no, they will ask for it. They feel like they can essentially just rob you if you're a big name coming over there trying to get one of their players. And it gets really dumb, but yeah, it's not just one person you can blame. It's not like you can just blame orcs. You can just blame players, just blame agents. It's all just kind of screwing each other, but also screwing themselves in the long term. They just don't know that yet.
Yeah.
We already kind of had this happen before, like a bubble that grew. It didn't burst, but it definitely deflated a little bit. And now they're back to just pumping it, hoping this time, hey, maybe we can blow it up. Maybe that'll be a fun thing for the scene. Let's see how it goes.
The only thing is, though, I will point this out. Even though I do blame the Saudis in part for initially inflating this particular bubble, they actually might end up, as the bigger context of this discussion comes, it might end up actually working for them. Because the reason why it's genius for them to do it is their funding literally comes from a public investment fund for an entire country that is oil rich. So they are essentially, they have the deepest pockets of all. So what I don't think people realize is they really can do like Chelsea, Manchester United, they can just keep buying. If it doesn't work, they can just keep buying. Like the joke is, if they get an equal Monarchy, their Monarchy becomes shit, then they will just go and get like Donk, and then they will go and get like keeping certain players. And eventually, if they're really the ones, not only can they like win in this bidders market because they can bid the most, but unlike other people like Astralis, if they bid and they fuck up, they have to sort of have a lean year, and they have to do things here like kick Blame F, so you get rid of his contract and then get in Bro for cheap and do things like that. The Saudis, in theory, if they actually succeed and get the Nicos, the Simples, of the Monarchy, the massive names, they could actually potentially just make the biggest super team ever. And actually, I actually worry, if you think it's bad now with Heroic and ENCE, imagine how many other teams could be destroyed. Like the one people don't think about, and I tell you what, how well have all of those, not only did all the Team Liquid Cadian stories I hinted at before, they've aged fabulously, but all the G2 ones have aged fucking phenomenal. I kept telling you the whole time, but there's no public info. I think Nico and maybe Monarchy as well is gone. So I also think to myself, if next year Nico and Monarchy are gone, G2 is going to be rebuilding around Malbs, Hunter, and Snacks. Like, holy, that's a rough lineup. Like, there's another team that's top in the world now that could be completely destroyed and be like 11th best team again. Yeah, could happen again. Could be the same cycle, Sam.
It was rough already when you're thinking. Sorry, but the G2 point, I just have to touch on this. When we're thinking Monarchy, Malbs, Hunter.
That's enough, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I personally cut Snacks just because I don't like him, but
okay.
Call it personal bias, but
okay.
He's not fragging, he's not calling. What on earth is he there for? Yeah, at that point,
that's a hell of a tagline.
Those three players.
That's your documentary about him. I know he's not fragging, he's not calling. What is he there for? The Snacks story. Who is Snacks?
Entirely reasonable at this point, based on how they've played. I thought that's okay, but if you're taking Monarchy as well out, and I'm left with Hunter, Malbs, and then I guess if Snacks is still around, him, who
knows at that point?
I liked the idea of like, oh, you rebuild around Malbs, you make him the focal point. He's a young star, up and coming. Yeah. Maybe you get a real IGL. If you have to do that without Monarchy and you're G2 starting from essentially the bottom at that point, because you're no longer guaranteed tier 1 players. You have to go make a bunch of signings.
Yes.
You have to pay these ridiculous salaries, buyouts that we're talking about. Oh, that'd be so ugly. And very quickly could lead to them completely imploding.
Yes.
Do you think that Falcons has kind of shot themselves in the foot here, though? Because, Thorin, I hear what you're saying about, obviously, they've, the Saudis have all this money and everyone keeps saying that. But I also, in my experience, people with lots of money tend to be pretty smart about return on that money. So when they don't just throw it into a bottomless pit, they start asking for certain things. They'll give you all the cash and the business class tickets, but they do kind of expect results.
Sure.
Have they shot themselves in the foot, though? Because they're now in a situation where everyone has seen the supposed super team fall to pieces. They know that Falcons are limping along. Falcons now needs players. Anyone they go to, we're talking about this bubble.
Oh, it's going to be expensive,
Yeah, anyone who Falcons approaches, whether you're a tier 2 player that no one knows or you're a superstar, you're going to triple the amount of money you ask for because you know that they have to. So in a way, have they kind of put themselves in a really shitty position because they're going to have to now spend ridiculous amounts of money?
They have in the long run, especially if this lineup doesn't immediately work when they get an equal in. Like, obviously, that could, like, fix the whole thing. But if, as you say, if they end up having to sort of piece by piece take apart the last lineup and then rebuild it for next year, that, I mean, the names being proffered aren't just like, it is like Nico, honestly, simple. It's like the biggest names in the entire world. So, yeah, that would be very, very expensive. With that said, I know what you mean. I definitely don't think it's the case like people think. This is actually why I think the whole super team hype started when just Megisk and Zonic joined. People were like, they have a lot of money, so they'll spend it. It's like that. You're actually right. Normally, it's the other way around. Business people actually go, no, I need like a very good business plan before I do this. I actually don't blame them entirely, which sounds like a crazy thing to say, but here's the caveat. Because to be fair, this was also all happening at the beginning of CS2. Remember, CS2 was way more scuffed when it came out, and nobody at the time had any clue about how CS2 will play as an actual game for like styles, roles, different playing styles, calling styles. And so at the time, our assumption was it looks like CSGO with slightly more powerful smokes, and the models are a bit fucked for the movement when you do the kill. So everyone thought it's just CSGO, isn't it? And I do think, here's one of the things that I think is saddest about this Falcons team. I actually think this same exact Falcons team in CSGO would be better than this. I actually think their style would work way better. I think all the T-side stuff with Snappi would be way better. People like Madden and Megas would have been way better. I actually think the difference is I could actually have been like, I don't know, 5th or 6th best team, but be like a canny little team with a bit of tactics, and you know, you could have even had BOROS a little bit to make up for the firepower. I feel like if you make it a CSGO roster, that's a good roster. The problem is, I feel like, because as he said, Snappy's style was min-maxing. I feel like min-maxing doesn't work in CS2. Like, as we've seen with G2, on paper, that roster's not supposed to work at all, but it's just so much firepower, and CS2 is so much about T-side firepower with AKs. If they just shoot everyone in the head, you can actually just make the semi-finals of every tournament. So I think their problem as well is no one really could, when they gambled essentially on we're going to believe in Zonic and Snappi and what they can do with this team, they didn't realize that it turned out in CS2. I agree with KingT. In CSGO, my two most important roles is IGL and AWPer. It turns out in CS2, it might actually be like Star Rifler, like aggressive Star Rifler might be the most important and valuable player in the game. Because as we point out, even the AWP died. There's another thing that kills you. The one star you did get was SunPayUs. He's a HLT top 20 player. And AWPers themselves almost got nerfed by the game. Like, when everyone goes, but what about Monacy and Shiro? It's like, yeah, the joke is they're the only ones, bro. Everyone else dropped off. Cadian, Jame, keep going down the list. Nearly every AWPer went like at least, I'd say like 70-80% of their original level from CSGO. So you also ended up sort of with the wrong one. Like, you'd actually been better off getting Nico and not having SunPayUs. Maybe if SunPayUs had gone to Heroic and you had like a sus AWPer, you could have had an ultimate type player. You didn't know if they'd make it yet to gamble. That actually turns out maybe to have been a better gamble. So I also think you can't predict that, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's rough. I do love, though, now my conversations with coaches. When I try to get a lot of them on for like members content on my own channel. I always talk to them about this sort of thing. So many of them now just complain that the meta is like, semi-complaining. They have to have aggressive players who are willing to just swing and do these things. And you look at the roster, yeah, these guys are outstanding CSGO players in that they're great at holding an angle, the right angle, being in off angles, smartly playing off each other. They're not just going to wide swing. And I think Maui, alluded to this. They have started to implement that into their own style, but they're just clearly not very good at it. Like, guys like Dupree are not the cracked aimers that every other team is showing up to events with. Like, if you look at Sangel, they have Jota as a lurker. He's so aggressive compared to what we think of as a lurker. He's just swinging stuff. And he plays like big side anchor rolls. Just every now and then, you just tell him, just swing. Like, they're coming in, don't try to anchor, play passive, hold this off. No, just swing, headshot one, and that'll work. And that's become the go-to way to play. They really don't have that roster. So, yeah, entirely correct that CS2 essentially nerfed this specific roster, maybe more than any other, as we've come to expect. Like,
I'll give you an angle, by the way, no one's thought of. And this is actually hilarious because this just shows, Sam, they would have been damned if they did and damned if they didn't. If everyone remembers at the beginning of CS2, especially the beginning of this year, which is when Nico would have been in Falcons, Nico wasn't even as good because Nico tried to play old school. Nico clears every angle and goes to, and it turned out even Nico, if you don't know how he got better, he actually just upped the tempo of his game. He started playing like an aggressive player. So the joke is there actually is a world where even if they'd have had Nico, maybe they'd have still been underwhelming. Maybe they'd have just been where they were with BOROS. No one can know really. So that's actually the toughest thing about this particular scenario. We always talk about these teams and players like it was just the same game from CSGO to CS2, but exactly around the time they made this team was when the whole game changed in a way where we just didn't have time. No one could see in the future. I had no clue myself if it'd be different. I think it's taken months, like KingT says on talk shows, to crystallize these sort of takes about the general scene.
And that's the fun part, though, because everyone keeps talking about S1mple going to Falcons, right? They're like, oh, well, because Falcons, I think, is probably the only team.
Imagine that. Chuck him in there. Yeah, go for it.
But we don't actually know what S1mple looks like in CS2. That's been the thing, right? We actually don't know if he's going to be S1mple, KingT, or if it's going to be disappointing. All we saw was that brief little dance with Falcons, which I personally think was probably an audition that didn't go very well. But it was... It wasn't anything to write home about. So we don't actually know what we're getting with S1mple. Imagine paying all that money and not being 100% sure that this player can perform in CS2.
Well, that's going to be... I keep seeing that rumor, and I see it, the quote, thrown around, like having Messi and Ronaldo on the same team. I'm like, sure, if one of them's towards the end of his prime and the other one's just not been playing football for a year and a half. Like, it's a really terrible analogy, and shows maybe that exec isn't that in tune with the game itself. But look, S1mple, he's been away from the game for a long time. And I've seen, apparently, he's starting to scrim again. He's been trying to get himself back into fighting shape, as it were. But I genuinely hate the idea of bringing S1mple into the team. I mean, maybe, I think a lot of people would believe in him just because of the pedigree, because of the history, and clearly the talent. Like, there's no ever been denying S1mple's one of the most talented players we've ever seen in all of CS history. I just think this amount of time away from the game, being that he was an AWPer, try to bring in him either on a rifle or an AWP, I think it's just going to be brutal, especially with the amount of results they're going to want when they do finally bring in NiKo and then they bring in S1mple. It's going to be so much more demanding, and with a potentially new IGL in place with the whole like Megas taking over that captaincy role idea, it'll be such a difficult thing to make work. But the bright side is, he's always been one of the most aggressive players in Counter-Strike. If there's anyone who could make the comeback, it should be S1mple. He was known back in the day for taking ridiculous peaks with an AWP that shouldn't have worked in Go. This is the game where they're supposed to work. He can just swing out of position, quickscope someone. That should be entirely workable if he can get his mechanics back up to snuff. We know the talent's there, the playstyle's still pretty much there. And if he can come back as 90% of prime S1mple, that's still better than anything we've ever seen out of some players. No offense, lad. You're just not that guy.
Gents, thank you for coming on this meander with me. There was no real point to this. I've just always found this conversation absolutely fascinating. Much like Falcons. I just think it's fascinating how this one team made such a loud noise, and just the after effects are so interesting, and it's something we don't always talk about. I also think it sets a really nice foundation for next year when everything changes up. So thank you for just entertaining me for a little bit. And if you've been watching, let us know in the comments what you think, who you think is going to be going to the new Falcons lineup, because there's no doubt in my mind there will be a new one, and it'll probably cost a ton of money.